Welcome endgame fans. The position on the board is from a game between Albert Mandelbaum and Max Weiss, from a tournament played over the New Year in Vienna in 1895-96. And this was a 12-player double-round event won jointly by Max Weiss and Karl Schlechter. Playing white was Albert Mandelbaum, an Austrian player for whom very few games survive. It is known, though, that Mandelbaum was an advocate of the French defence to 1e4, which begins with the move 1e6. In fact, Mandelbaum regarded 1e6 so highly that he considered 1e4 to be a mistake. And he wrote that more people would recognise that 1e4 was a mistake, but for the fact that people preferred to meet 1e4 with 1e5. Well, playing black was Max Weiss, co-winner of the tournament, and one of the world's strongest players in the late 19th century. In fact, after winning the longest tournament to date in the history of chess, New York 1889, Weiss qualified for a World Championship match with Wilhelm Steinitz. But this match never took place because Weiss decided to retire from chess in his prime in order to pursue a career in Rothschild's bank. Well, now that the players have been introduced, let's consider the position. It's an ending of rook versus knight, and both players have g-pawns that are not yet locked. It's Mandelbaum white to move. So the question is, well, what should the result of the game be? And what is white's best move here? Now, if you'd like to have a go at this problem, pause the video here. Okay, well, welcome back if you decided to tackle this one. Now, if you've viewed previous videos, you won't be surprised to hear that the Woltzman strongly recommends Averbach's comprehensive chess endings as a guide as to how to best approach thematic positions like this one. Now, Averbach counsels that the result of the game, if the pawns are locked, depends primarily on how far up the board the pawns are locked. And this is because there are two key winning ideas for the attacker. Well, the first idea is to sacrifice the exchange in order to bring about a winning king and pawn ending. And then the second idea is to try and mount an assault with the rook from the rear in order to win the enemy g-pawn. And Averbach shows that the worst positions to have are where the pawns are locked either low down or high up on the board. So the worst positions are where the pawns are locked on the second and third, or third and fourth ranks, or the sixth and seventh ranks. As usual, centre pawns offer better winning chances than knight's pawns, because with a centre pawn, the attacker can go around both sides of the pawn, whereas with a knight's pawn you can only go around one side. But these general principles nevertheless apply to knight's pawns, so long as the defender's pieces are optimally placed. Well, let's have a look at Averbach's analysis then. Let's set this position up. The defender's pieces are optimally placed on f3 and g3, and the pawns this time are locked on the fourth and fifth rank. And Averbach shows that this position is drawn. Well, let's give black the move and see why. So black to move plays rook a3, pinning the knight. The white king gets out of the pin. Black can only go around the pawn in one direction, so he goes king f6. And now we'll play a move that gives black a chance. We'll play king g3, going back into the pin. And this enables the black king to leave the g-pawn. And the pin on the knight means that white can't take the g-pawn. So white again gets out of the pin, and now white is threatening to play knight takes pawn. So the only way for black to make progress here is to sacrifice the exchange, rook takes knight. White recaptures. Black goes king d5. White goes king e3, and now black can take the opposition with king e5. So black has the opposition. Grounds for some optimism, but as we'll see, it's not enough to win the game. White goes king f3, allowing the black king to penetrate a bit further with king d4. And now after king e2, king e4, black again takes the opposition. And he keeps the opposition after king f2, king f4. And now a mistake would be to go king g2, because black can then capture the pawn and keep the opposition, and you don't want to allow that. So instead white goes king f1. That's a clever move, because after king takes g4, white goes king g2 and transfers the move to black. White takes the opposition. And the key squares are f3, g3 and h3, and so long as white has the opposition, black can never gain control of any of these squares, and so the king and pawn ending is drawn. Okay, well, let's look at a related position. So what we've done is just to move the position down a rank. So now the pawns are locked on the third and fourth ranks. Again, we'll give black the move and we'll see what happens this time. So as before, black pins the knight. The white king gets out of the pin. Black goes king f5 to go round the pawn. White marks time. Black goes king e5. White goes king g1, threatening to take the pawn. And again, black sacrifices the exchange. Rook takes knight. And after king takes rook, black goes king d4. White goes king e2 and black goes king e4, taking the opposition. White goes king f2, black king penetrates. And now white's best defense is to play king f1. So after king e3, he has king e1 opposing. But it's not going to be enough. Black goes king f3. And after king f1, black goes king takes g3. And because the pawn is on g4, white is going to lose after king g1. Let's just verify this. After king f3, king f1, g3, king g1, g2, the pawn is going to queen. So that position is won for the attacker. Okay, well let's look at one more position and then we'll go back to Mandelbaum versus Weiss. So here the pawns are locked on the 6th and the 7th ranks. Let's see what happens now. Black goes rook a5 as before, pinning the knight. White goes king g4. But now, because of the greater distance, because the g6 pawn is further up the board, black can mount an assault from the rear. He can go rook a1. White goes king g5, black checks from the rear, rook g1 check. And the white king has to go to h5. He has to stay on the g6 pawn, defending it. Now there's a clever little manoeuvre to lose a move. Black goes rook g2. White goes knight e3, attacking the rook, so the rook attacks the knight. The knight goes to f5, attacking the rook. And the rook goes to g1. And the point of all this is that now after knight e3, the rook is no longer attacked. And this gives black the chance to go king e7. While black's threatening to go king f6, so white goes knight g4, controlling f6. So the black king advances, he goes to e6. White goes king g5, trying to hold the king off, but now the black rook can swing over and give some lateral checks, goes to a1. White goes knight e3 and the black rook checks on a5. And this forces the white king to leave the 5th rank. He goes king g4, and now black can go king f6, and he's going to win the g-pawn and the game. Now, if you were eagle-eyed, you will have noticed that when I set the position up, I put the black king on f8 rather than g8. And this was a material change, because with the king on g8, the position is in fact only a draw. And let's just see why this is the case. If black goes rook a5, white goes king g4, black goes rook a1. And the difference is that with the king on g8, white has got this check. He can go knight e7 check. And after king f8, he goes knight d5. And notice that now there's a little force field. e7 and f5 are both under white's control. So the black king has to go around this force field. It goes king e8, white goes king f5, black goes king d7, and now the white knight goes to f4. Black pins, white gets out of the pin, the king goes to e7, and now the knight can go to h5. And on h5, the knight guards the f6 square and also threatens to take the pawn on g7. Black checks, white goes king f5, and now black has to go back to defend that pawn. White goes knight f4, black goes king e7, but white just goes back with knight h5. And there's no way for black to make further progress, so this position is drawn. Now, in this example, notice that the knight ends up harassing the enemy pawn from the h-file, on the right-hand side. And it turns out that the knight is even more effective as a harasser on the h-file than it is on the f-file, because it's guarding this penetration square on f6 as well as attacking the enemy pawn. Okay, well, let's return now to Mandelbaum versus Weiss. Now, armed with what we now know, it's clear that white can assure himself of a draw here by going g4, because he's now locked the pawns on the 4th and 5th ranks. And after the moves king f6, king f3, there's just no way for black to make progress. Sacrificing the exchange is not going to bring about a one king and pawn ending. And perhaps as an exercise, you'd like to verify that for yourself after you've finished watching the video. So congratulations if you work this out. Now in the game though, Mandelbaum didn't play g4, and instead he went king f3. And this move is a losing move, and it loses because black can now engineer things so that he plays g4, locking the pawns on the 3rd and the 4th rank. And he can do this by playing the move rook d3 check. And at first sight, it looks like this move is nothing to be afraid of, because white can go king g4. And now both the king and the knight are attacking the g-pawn. The g-pawn seems doomed. But black goes king f6, and if white were to capture, knight takes g5, then rook d4 check wins the knight. So that's no good. White can't do that. So instead, white's knight moves to f2, attacking the rook, but the rook just moves away to a3. White gives a check. Again, king and knight both attack the g-pawn. But after king g6, it's again not possible to play knight takes g5, because this time rook a4 check would win the knight. So white must fall back with knight f2. And now black checks rook a4 check. And if white goes king h3, then black has the move king f5. And if g4, he can go king f4, penetrating. So instead, white falls back with king f3. But now black can play king h5, and he wants to go g4. And he's going to get this move in, because if g4 check, then king h4 penetrates and wins. While if white goes knight d3, now black succeeds in getting g4 check in. And after king g2, rook a2 check, knight f2, king g5, we arrive at a position that we've analysed using Averbach, and we know that this is a win for black. Black can win by sacrificing the exchange. Okay, but after king f3, Weiss missed his chance, and he replied king f6, letting the opportunity slip. And play continued knight f2, rook d4, and now Mandelbaum played the correct g4, locking the pawns on the 4th and the 5th ranks. Rook f4 check happened, White went king g3. Black went rook a4. White went knight h3, attacking the pawn. Black went rook a3 check. White went king g2. And the sacrifice of rook takes knight doesn't work here. So Weiss marked time with rook b3. And now White should probably play just the move knight f2. But instead he played king h2, and although this doesn't lose, it does enable Black to set up a decent try. Because here, Weiss played the very clever king e5 move. And in this position there was certainly an argument for going back with king g2. But you can appreciate why Mandelbaum took the opportunity to play knight takes g5. Black went king f4, attacking the knight. And now the knight must move away from the king. Mandelbaum played knight e6 check. And Weiss captured the pawn. So White's problem here is that the king and the knight have become detached, and he must try and reconnect them in order to draw the game. And since knight d4, rook d3 is no good, notice how the rook and the king are controlling many of the squares, and knight e2 is not going to be possible because of rook d2. White must instead go king g2 here. Black went rook e3, attacking the knight. The knight went to d4, and the rook attacked the knight again. He went rook e4. And so now the question is, well, where should White move the attacked knight? Now, unfortunately, Mandelbaum chose the move knight c6. And this is fatal because the rook controls d4, b4 and e5, and these are all squares needed on the knight's route back to connect with the king. So Weiss from here forced victory with the move king f4. The white king desperately tries to get close to the knight. He goes to f2. But black went rook c4, and this forces the knight further away. It went to e7. Black took the opportunity to play rook c2 check, creating even more distance between the king and the knight. White went to g1. Black went rook c5, again taking squares away from the knight. And the knight can't go to d5, and he can't go to g6 either, because rook g5 check would win it. Although, having said that, knight g6 check was in fact played, because it is a check. Black went king g3, threatening mate. White went king f1. Black went rook f5 check. White went king g1. If king e1, then just rook f6 is effective. After king g1, black went rook f6 anyway. Mandelbaum tried knight e7, and now Weiss finished the game very effectively indeed. He played rook f3, knight g8, rook e3, threatening mate, king f1, so he only moved to avoid mate, but now black goes rook e6, and now the rook controls all of the knight squares, so the knight is completely helpless, and black can just bring his king up the board, capture the knight, and then the king and rook will mate the white king. So here Mandelbaum resigned. In fact, it's mate or loss of the knight next move. Yes, black doesn't even need to take his king up the board. King g1, rook e1 is mate, and if the knight moves, it's lost. So a hopeless position. Okay, let's go back. So, as we've seen, knight c6 proved fatal for Mandelbaum, but he could have saved himself by going knight b5. And this is going to draw because there are now routes back for the knight. Rook c4, tried to cut off the c3 and d4 square. The white king comes over though to give support to the knight. Black king follows, but the white king just keeps going. And now black cannot go king e4 because of knight d6 check, so he has to go king e5, and this enables the white king to break out. It goes king d3, and now the knight and the king are going to become reunited, and so white will be able to draw that ending. Okay, well, as ever, the position was chosen for its instructional value, and with no disrespect intended for the players whatsoever. Remember that the game was played 50 years before Averbach published his groundbreaking analysis. There was very little resource available to players when this game was played, and they had to figure out these endings largely for themselves. Well, thank you very much for watching.